Hey everyone, my name is Tristan Simmons, and for my video essay project, I decided to do something a little different. So, I am a firm believer from what I have done before this research, from my personal experiences, and from other research that I have done for other classes, that video games are a very positive aspect to social environments and basically anything. I think that video games are predominantly positive in the outcomes that they have and the effects that they have on individuals. However, for this project, I wanted to do something that challenged my beliefs, so I decided to do my research on any possible negative effects that video games could have on the individuals that play them, specifically the younger generation and children and adolescents. So to start off my research, I basically went online, I looked at all of these, like a bunch of different peer-reviewed articles, and I went through there, and to be honest, the majority of the situations that are focused on in these articles that focus on the negative effects of video games are predominantly focused on violence. So violent tendencies in video games is a big topic recently, and by recently I mean for probably at least a decade, and it's one of the main issues that people want to bring up, but either fighting against the popularity of video games or just negative effects in general, and from my own personal experience, my parents' excuses as to why I shouldn't play so many video games. But to be fair, I'm one of the furthest from violent people you ever meet, but that's besides the point. This isn't personal experience, this is based on research. So video games are a very pervasive pastime activity that begins to show interest in individuals from what I found around ages from 8 to 18. So that's the prime area that you see people start to pick up video games and start to show interest in them, and that's when most people have at some point in their lives started to play video games, even if it's just a little bit. Video games are a very controversial topic on both the scientific and the political spectrum, just due to many discussions related to negative and positive effects on the mental and physical health of those that play them. In my research, I was intending to find information related to the negative health effects, as I am someone who does typically view them as positive. And I did, like I said before, want to challenge my beliefs, and I kind of just wanted to discover some more information. So the cumulative results of the articles that I chose for my research showed that a mean average of individuals that play video games is about 94% of girls, and about roughly 99% of boys have played video games by the time they reach their teen years. So around the time they reach 13, those percentages of males and females have typically played at least one video game. So this research also showed that boys typically spend about 13 hours per week playing video games, as opposed to girls who averaged about 5 per week. So it is a predominantly male-focused genre, but that doesn't at all not include girls and females in this, because they still are a very large part of this community. It's just less predominant in that demographic. And there's a growing number of studies that show positive correlations between video games and pedagogical outcomes of like health in these players. But again, a lot of the articles I could find were for positive interactions, and I really wanted to challenge myself and get those negative ones. So one of the first ones that I found was based on violence and video games. So with how widespread video games are, and with the rising popularity that the game industry is experiencing, the thought of what is intended versus what is unintended in these experiences that these individuals have becomes more prevalent. So this question is not one that's very easily answered, to be fair, or understood, due to the large divide that exists between like the different audiences and the different genres of video games. So, for example, the effects of violent video games on aggression is what I found predominantly in these articles. And on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, there's many studies analyzing the effects of video games on improving visuospatial attention spans. So there's so many different areas of study, there's so many different intertwined aspects of these studies, and there's so many different audiences, so many different genres of video games, that it's very difficult to talk about video games as a whole, because there's so many different factors that go into this. But the growing number of focus and studies on multiple other effects of video games, such as social and antisocial behaviors, cognitive styles, and affective processing, there's a growing number of aspects that are being studied due to the multiple dimensions that these differences provide. So the one I wanted to focus on first, which was violence, was it was very difficult to find something on violence because it seems like a lot of these articles have been either debunked through other studies. But the main research that I found on violent video games use measures to assess aggression that don't correlate with real-world violence. So some studies are observational and don't prove a cause and effect relationship. Federal crime statistics have shown a general decrease in crime since 1996, and this really does not correlate with the soaring video game industry since around the late 90s. If there was a true cause and effect scenario associated with violence in video games, we would most definitely see a drastic spike due to the sheer popularity of video games from that time period until now. The largest factor preventing the condemnation of violent video games is the ability for parents and guardians to limit the types of video games that children play along with the amount of time that they play them. However, the strongest argument advocating for the causation of exhibited violence tendencies is the social learning tendencies of children and adolescents. So some of the articles that I saw on there were basically talking about how children and adolescents learn behavioral patterns through mimicking those around them. And the question that everybody seems to draw the conclusion from automatically is, well, therefore, this should translate to video games, right? So they see something happen in video games and they're automatically going to do it because they think it's acceptable and because, they're just taught. They're in their learning phase. And there are actual cited sources. There are unfortunate news articles of some things that have happened in the past. There was a 13-year-old boy who lived in an apartment complex in New York City around 2013 who jumped out of his apartment window because in one of the video games that he played, it was a wrestling video game, one of the people in that video game used a sheet, just a bed sheet, as a parachute. And this kid thought it was a really fun idea and unfortunately did try to do the same thing off of the 13th story of his apartment building with a sheet, and of course that didn't work out very well and did not make it, unfortunately. This is one of those examples that are cited several times in some of the studies that I found. To be honest, a source from 2013 being used in all these modern studies has given me a little bit of cognitive dissonance in terms of why this is one of the only sources that can be cited for one of these behavioral changes that can be attributed to video games. But again, I was really trying to test my beliefs here, and I was adamant to find at least something that showed even a moderate correlation, or at least some sort of outlet. Well, this answer for that question that I asked earlier about it should relate to video games, they do mimic those things around them. It becomes increasingly difficult to prove as we research deeper. Popular studies have debunked these ideas as well as studied the personality traits of young individuals, and to be honest, most adolescent offenders that are video game players exhibited these negative and aggressive personality traits before even being introduced to video games and before having them play a large part in their behavioral patterns. And most people that are included in these studies are patients that have had pre-existing conditions or pre-existing issues with violent tendencies. So again, it's another aspect that I thought was going to be a lead, but wound up being debunked through a little bit more research. So one of the other aspects that I wanted to go over in this was social skills. There is an overwhelming amount of positive correlation on social skills, which I thought was going to have more negative effects on it. So to be honest, the negative effects on social skills are prevalent, but what seems to happen is that with social skills, video games tend to exacerbate already pre-existing conditions. So if someone is a very social individual already, it exacerbates that and allows them another outlet to be even more social online. So when they're at home, they don't have to leave their home and they're allowed to be more social. And then when it comes to someone who might be a little bit more introverted and is not as social as others, it also exacerbates that. It gives them an outlet to do something that they want to do and allows them to have a pastime that doesn't necessarily have to include social interaction. Obviously, there are some situations where vice versa. Some people find it very difficult if they're social in person to be social online, but most of the time it does already make them even more social because it gives them a different outlet. The only one that actually seems to be about more equal instead of outweighed by the other option is for some introverted individuals. It actually gives them an outlet that might feel more comfortable for them to be more social. So online, they're behind a screen. They have already something in common with those that they're interacting with. So they feel maybe a little bit more comfortable socially interacting with them because there's less pressures and there's more in common and there's less uncertainty. And that's relatively tied with the outcomes when it comes to individuals that become more introverted. So introverted individuals typically have a better time playing video games because it can open them up and make things more comfortable for them and kind of create a safe space. Mental health is another aspect that came up with video games. It wasn't as prevalent because, again, as I said before, a lot of the factors that go into this is already pre-existing medical conditions or pre-existing behavioral patterns, and those who typically have struggles with mental health have these situations either stay the same or exacerbated by video games. Video games can cause anxiety, which is definitely something that is, I found that was majorly negative in these studies, was the amount of anxiety that video games can cause. So even if you don't realize it, sometimes you can start shaking during video games. It can stress you out. They're supposed to be fun, but certain first-person shooters or competitive video games can create these toxic environments that we can find ourselves in, and sometimes we become numb to just how toxic they are. But it can really affect our mood, and it can really put us in stressful scenarios or very negative headspaces for the time being that we're playing them. So one of the actual proven negative effects of video games is that competitive video games have a very high stress level on the people that play them, and it also creates a divide and it creates a hateful environment for some people as well, because if someone isn't enjoying a video game or someone thinks that their team is the problem and they're not the issue when playing a competitive video game or being in a competitive lobby, they typically like to insult the other individuals. And a lot of people in the video game industry and the video game community really like to throw around possible derogatory terms, personal insults, and even though it's easy to just say you can write that off, sometimes it really does affect people in ways that we don't expect, and maybe people might be more sensitive to it. So one of the ways that mental health is affected is most definitely negative in this case, and it can very much drive someone into more of a depressive or anxious or stressful state. One of the major aspects that doesn't necessarily correlate to a negative ideology or headspace is that video games are a way to escape reality. So for some individuals, it allows them to escape maybe the stress of their day. The only argument that I could find for this actually being some sort of a negative cause or negative effect on the individuals that use them as an ability to escape reality is that it can drive people to have a false sense of reality. There wasn't too much hardcore research on this that had any conclusive evidence, which was very difficult for me to talk about, but I did want to explore all aspects of how video games could be negative. Majority of it was focused on violence as earlier and some on mental health. However, this was another argument that was made, kind of debunked, as having an escape is typically thought of as a good thing. But again, when it comes to things like this, if someone is trying to escape reality and it winds up having a negative effect on them, it's already because of pre-existing conditions most likely that are exacerbated by video games themselves, not necessarily by video games creating these issues. So my conclusion based upon this research was actually quite surprising. So I went into this assuming that I would be able to find a very large amount of studies and a very large amount of information that did point to at least some negative effects that video games could have with strong evidence. And I did expect there to be some actual studies that would very much confirm these beliefs that some other individuals had. And I expected that, and I fully expected that, putting my personal opinions aside. But however, I was actually pleasantly surprised that most of the research I had found was either already debunked or had very strong evidence against it that was also included in the peer-reviewed articles. So most of the articles that were for this weren't directly focused on negative effects. It was kind of focused on how negative effects are interpreted. And I thought that was super interesting because I feel like the video game industry has transitioned from a point before where it was kind of viewed more negatively, and it was more popular to view it negatively than it is now. And I feel like a lot of individuals, especially scholars, are coming around and they are finding this research, and they are saying that, hey, video games are a majority a positive impact. It's just you have to have a controlled environment for your children. You have to already know if someone is struggling with certain mental health issues or certain stress levels or certain violent tendencies. And maybe at that point then you decide, is it good to restrict their access to video games? So overall, yes, my research actually was much more positive than I thought, and it was very difficult for me to prove or even hint at certain negative effects of video games, and I am very happy that actually that was my conclusion. So thank you for listening to this. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you found this informative. And yeah, thank you.